welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we're going to talk about how to draw a cute baby elephant. So, let's get arting. Alright, so as we draw the elephant, we're going to have all the strokes coming down. I know they have a lot of sort of wrinkles down their trunk, but it's going to be easier to sort of sketch it down and then add highlights and shadows to indicate that wrinkling. Just like always, we're going to be following the contour of the head, and we'll get started. So I'm going to ignore all of those little like extra lines, but you can see as I'm drawing up top that just like before, right, I'm still kind of doing that rounded stroke. It makes it easier to keep the lines contained, but as I come over towards the middle, I'm going to have to straighten it up before I switch sides. And then we can loop it the other way. Just like with fur, I'm still interlocking the way I do the lines, right? I'm still putting lines in between instead of just following one out. I'm mindful about that. But looping your lines like this makes it a lot easier to stay within a confine, especially on an animal like an elephant that doesn't have fur. So it's a little less forgiving as to what the human eye is going to notice how we've drawn it. But with this sort of sketchy style, it is still very forgiving. And there is room for us to go beyond that edge. Even on an edge like this, you know, I'm still kind of looping it in, even though now we're going straight down. Here I'm not, because we have the ear that ties in, and so where the ear's tying in, I'm going to follow that contour, but once we break free from the ear, I'm going to curve these lines in as I head it down, as I angle it down. And of course I am mindful of the contour of the elephant, right? So there's a dip here on all elephants, so being mindful of that. Following that shape a bit. Right, so I have these coming in and this actually swooping out following that shape, so that'll help indicate that when we add shadows and highlights, that line direction change. And because I'm not bound by fur length, I'm making these longer. It'll help make it go a little quicker because there's no limit to really to how long the skin is. Unlike with fur, where you try fur or hair, you know, in order to achieve the sort of realistic effect, you have to kind of keep it to the length of the fur or hair that you're drawing. So if it's a short-haired animal, you know, it takes a little longer. When you don't have to worry about that, you can cover a lot of ground a lot quicker. And you can see I'm following the contour of the head, right? So I have a dip coming out to a bulge. That matches that. I'm going to follow the contour around the eyes as well. So a lot of the details are going to be fleshed out in the highlights and shadows. That's why I left the wrinkles on here. I'm going to talk more in depth on this side about how I did that eye. So I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to have some angling forward, but because of needing to worry about line reconciliation, I'm going to have some coming straight down, and then we're going to loop some behind it. So we'll have kind of a bulge there. And then underneath, you know, we're going to have this kind of coming this way and down. We're going to have that sort of looping effect that we do under the eye. And have that sort of meet in the middle as well. There we go. It's highlights and shadows should really be able to flesh out a lot of their wrinkles. It's just when you come to a tricky section, you just have to make sure that there's not any line conflicts. That's really important to making sure it works. So as the head comes in, right, you have the bulge of the head, and that's going to be angling in as we get to the trunk. As I come down underneath, I'm still trying to angle that a bit. It softens that line. And I'm going to run it into that edge of where the trunk is. Even though this line will also be curved in, this will help indicate a change, right? Because we're going to angle this down before we angle it in, just like we are against this section of the trunk as well. All of those line changes will help visually indicate, you know, a change in elevation. I don't know if that's the right word, but it'll you know, indicate to us that it's a different, you know, thing. You have a cheek running into a tusk. I mean, a tusk. Little babies don't have the tusks. A cheek running into the trunk, and that there's a gap, you know, in level there. This will also help temper the shadows in between, because we already have this now going this way. The shadows in between the ridges on the tusk, I keep calling it the tusk, on the trunk. This will help it not be as dark, which the folds in the trunk wouldn't be, you know, very deep, especially not on a baby, where all of that's going to be a little lighter and looser. So having the lines go this way will help temper some of the deep shadowing. And it shouldn't affect, you know, it won't make it too light. It should still be dark enough once we start adding the highlights. He's already looking pretty cute. And now to give him some ears. Now as I'm doing the ear, like I did on the other side, I need to be mindful again of line conflicts. So I'm going to flop, right, this direction is going in just like we did here, and then I flopped it, but in a way that it all looked smooth and seamless. So I'm going to try and do the same thing to this one, you know, have it coming in on one side, and then we'll flop it by cutting that corner. And then slowly angling it the other way. So now that swoop's happening the opposite side. This side's a little harder for me to draw on, so takes a little extra back and forth for me to get the lines right. And some re-angling. But it's all done in a way that should make it relatively easy. And still swooping down, so we still have some of this angle coming, right? So as I bring this down, I'm going to create a little bit of a dip, because this will be a bulge as the ear comes in, before we are now sort of on even territory here. And it's just a matter of bringing it down. Comes straight off of the bottom. The reason I'm looping it in just a little here is to help indicate again a difference in space, right? The ears are behind the bulge in the head, so it's an easy way to create a subtle difference like that. You have a change in lines. Visually that'll help, not only for me to see it when I'm adding highlights and shadows, but I'm not really sure when my voice just cracked. Not only when I'm adding highlights and shadows, but also when, you know, I can see the differences, the highlights and shadows, especially on a shadowed section, right? If I do the light source over here, this will be in shadow. These lighter line strokes that I'll have to do in general will help. That'll help have a change in direction. And we'll just follow the contour of the outside of the ear here and loop it in as the ear loops in, which will make it easier in the long run to sort of loop it down and angle it towards here as like the bottom. All right, so now that he's sketched in, I think I am going to have the light source coming from over here. And just like always, that means it's coming from, you know, in front of, right? So it's coming from this sort of angle, like the sun would be, you know, above and in front. It's going to allow the subject to show up the best in that it's in front, and so it's hitting the face, and then it's going to round into shadow, you know, as we round on this side. So let's get started. We have a lot of little wrinkles, and so we're going to draw along those wrinkles, add highlights and shadows to those. Now his eye, usually on this back side, right, there's some shadow, but because their eyes are turned a little bit more to the side, on the side of their face, I have the whole thing in highlight. So the deeper the shadow, you know, the deeper the sort of the deeper a crevice will go, or the higher a peak will go. So, you know, the wrinkles we want to make sure are tapered a bit. So I'm filling in some of that so it's not as harsh, because it won't look right. Otherwise, it'll look like he has really deep shadows, really deep wrinkles, I should say. And so while we do want to indicate he has wrinkles, you know, we want to make sure it's a bit more tapered. More like that. And again, on the side of his face, there will also be shadow because of, you know, every three-dimensional object, you know, just like always, every three-dimensional object, as it's rounding, even on the side closest to the light source, will be in shadow. Basically, all edges of an object turn shadow. It's just got a lesser shadow than that of the other side. And then, of course, as it comes underneath, that shadow will deepen. Now the trick to making a lot of like skin details like this work is filling in the gaps, right? Like I don't want it too extreme because it's a small wrinkle, and so you have to sort of feather it in. Otherwise it is too drawing and it doesn't quite work, right? So as we come in here, we've got to feather all of these little spots in, and it tempers off the extreme sort of coloration change that they go through, that highlight, that extreme light and shadow. What it leaves is a nice little subtle detail that creates a textured effect. Of course, it depends on the extremity of the, how extreme the effect you're going for is. If it is deeper wrinkles or something, you maybe want to leave it a little bit more jagged like this. But on this guy, it wouldn't be. Takes a little bit more time to do, especially the way I'm doing it, where I'm filling in all those individual little sections. It can take a while to do, but the effect can look amazing when you're done. Now the more I want to temper this, you know, the more I would add. So the more I would add, the more lines I would add, and the darker sections, right, the more I would flesh that out. Just depends on how well I think it's done. Overall, he's a baby, so I can probably temper out some of this a bit more, but I don't think it looks horrible. I think it's showing up nicely so far. Let's see how it looks at the end. Now as I'm coming here, right, again, this little bulge on the nose, it would be in shadow on the edge and then underneath before it kicks into highlight. Now another challenge is going to be, as I bring this around, making sure that where the shadow kicks in makes sense all the way down. So, you know, I'm not shadowing across, doing up and down, which will make that just a little trickier as I'm trying to decide how to match them all up. In fact, at this point, I'm just going to listen up my pin pressure. That'll let me decide as I go forward. Be a little easier. Now, even though, in theory, his eye over here is going to be in more of a shadow, I am going to give him a little bit of a burst. It'll help define the shape just a bit. Not much. It'll still be, it's still on that shadowed side, but just a little bit. Especially down on the underside of the eye. Right down here. Just that extra oomph. It's a good way to highlight the eyes by giving them just a little, like, light even when there wouldn't be, as, you know, keeping as accurate as I can, but still sometimes fudging it just a bit. I'm going to give this also a little bit of burst right here, because his head kind of goes into this dip back here. So I want the section before it dips down to be a little brighter, even though it's going into shadow. And that problem with the sketch layer, right, is I need it because of how much detail I sort of drew on it. But, you know, you can definitely see where connections aren't happening without it. Alright, now we will finish up the nose. In fact, I think I'm going to go ahead and add in this lighter sketch color. Give me a little bit more control overall. I'll have the shadows fleshed out. It'll give me a chance to flesh out the highlights a little easier. And the details of the ridges on the nose. And because of how I'm doing this, you know, I just want to make sure that the edges make sense. That's why I backed out and took a look at it. That's why I'm doing it a bit more on this one. You know, I need to make sure that the shadow's kicking in on this side in a way that makes sense all the way down, and that this side doesn't look too blatantly obvious that I'm tapering off before I get to the edge. So making some minute adjustments as I go. But overall, I think it's working out pretty good. Again, because of how I'm doing this, it's just a little bit more time consuming. Sketching step was easier. In some ways it's easier. You know, I don't have to worry about this edge having lines going this way, but in other ways it's harder. Just sort of the way it goes, but you know, it's these little details that'll make a great effect at the end, I hope. All of his wrinkles, the wrinkles on his nose, all the wrinkles in his face help contribute to having wrinkles on his nose without his nose looking like it's out of place, right? If I pull this back, you know, and take this off, and all I had were wrinkles down his nose, might not work as well, but by adding in all the wrinkles on his face, you know, it doesn't seem like it's out of place. And it's such an important part to an elephant. If I were drawing one, you know, you do want to keep that feature. That's what's going to, you know, help us look at it and be like, oh yeah, it's an elephant, nice details, you know, whatever it is. The only thing is the nose is a bit brighter, so I'm probably going to have to brighten up some of this, like through here. Right, the nose is brighter because I'm having to pack in the lines a little bit more. But that means this seems less bright, so just fine. It's just a matter of going back and mimicking that same brightness. Alright, so now we just have to get the ears done, and that should be it. The ears don't have all of the same wrinkles. They do a bit right where they're connecting in, but otherwise they don't really. So I'm actually gonna just go ahead and lightly fill it in so that I can add the highlights. The ears do have some ruffles at the bottom. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this. If I lightly fill in both sides, then I can sort out where there's going to be bulges of highlight and get this edge sort of sorted as well. Although partway through this ear I may change my mind because it's a lot of open space. Alright, so, you know, it looks good, but obviously this ear needs some fleshing out, but definitely making some progress. So some of what I did down here, right, like worrying about these little extra ridges. Elephants have little, like, ridges in their ears where, you know, it kind of flaps. And so making sure it's got that little waviness, and that's going to be done through these shadows and highlights, right? But you got to make sure that it's not overpowering, so I was taming that off a bit. And I'm still fiddling with it, as we can see. And then I'm going to give a little bit of a burst to this little wave in the ear as well. So right as I bring the shadow down on this ear on the left, you know, his face would be casting a shadow, so just trying to make sure that makes sense. So I'm starting here, and then I'm sort of pulling it out. So as it comes, I'm coming further down the ear tip, because his face would, you know, that shadow would be curving away. The ear is going to be far enough down, it'll catch more before it goes back into shadow. So as I'm doing the humps right, I'm choosing the spots in the ear that are coming up. That's where the bump would be. And, on this side, I've just got to be a little more careful. Can't make it nearly as extreme, but I can still indicate it's there. Alright, so now for his eyes, I'm actually just going to give him some little drawn in semicircles. Better than that. Just making these minute changes to make sure it makes sense. It's an easy way to do an eye, right? You just take the select tool and you can draw the highlight out, just sort of a almost a teardrop shape. I try to think of the curvature of the eye because that's how it's going to be catching. This eye would catch less, that's why it's a smaller sort of dot. But I often try to make sure it's still catching some light. I'm actually going to trim it. I know I've already trimmed it once, but I'm going to trim it again. This would get, it might not even catch the light at all, but I do it to help give some emphasis to the eyes, but that means I want to make sure I'm doing it right. This is why I'm being so particular. And so basically what you want to do in those cases is just make sure it's basically the light flare, right? That's what I'm putting on the eye. When I am just doing the light flare, sometimes you can do it as just a straight oval, but sometimes I find it easier to just draw it in. Alright, so that is how you draw a baby elephant. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.